Rose.
Thanks for having me on. Good to be back.
Congratulations on your new book. And I want to start off with this remarkable childhood that you had. I mean, 17 schools. You've basically been in school in the inner city. You've been in the school in Harvard. You've been across the board. It's absolutely fascinating. Why don't we start with that? Because it kind of paints a picture of your life experiences and how you got here today.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny when someone asks me where are you from, I say I'm from America here in the U.S. because I'm from so many different places, growing up in a motorhome, but also in houses, in sheds and tents, having one of my siblings being born while the family was living in a tent. So it was a lot of just different parts of the country, and there were some beautiful aspects of that. That's how I learned to love this great country, being exposed to some of the most beautiful, seeing Mount Rushmore and going down to visit New Orleans and tasting jambalaya and visiting Robert Frost's home in Vermont. So there were parts of my experience as a child that I really treasured that taught me to love America. But there unfortunately was a lot of abuse as well.
Absolutely. So, well, why don't we start with this? You were actually ended up in Kansas City. That's one kind of very memorable, at least for me, from reading. And, I can't remember what year it was, but this was already a very kind of serious way to go to school. You were going through metal detectors. I think you were one of two white girls in the school system in the first place. So you stood out quite a bit. And it was just something that I think a lot of people that might be watching this show just aren't familiar with.
Yeah, I mean, it was in the mid-90s, I think around 1994 and 1996. I was in middle school, and that first day, I remember walking in with my mom, and I just felt like we were walking into like a juvenile detention center. But this was just a regular middle school, and that experience being for 2 years, nearly 2 years in these schools, it forever emblazed in my mind the importance of school choice, because these were very difficult academic environments. This was the first school district, Kansas City Public School District, in the entire country to ever lose its accreditation, which is an incredible dishonor. And this was, overwhelmingly black school, one of only a handful of white students. I was bullied for being white. My black friends were bullied for being friends with a white girl. But the worst part about this whole experience was the just dangerous learning environment. You had to wait through the metal detector. Sometimes you had to, be out in the cold for maybe an hour or so. We all had to go into a holding pen in the morning in order to go there first. Everyone had to sit there, and sometimes fights would break out. And then once everybody got through the metal detectors, then we were allowed to go to classrooms. But if you're pent up and everyone's fighting, you go and you bring that chaos to the classroom, which is what happened. So you have students throwing chairs at each other. It's just utter chaos. And meanwhile, the adults in the room, a lot of them are afraid. The teachers are having to call the security office. But then just the academics. I was in 6th grade and 8th grade, and I'm doing things that I'd seen maybe in like 1st or 2nd grade. So to me, it shocks the conscience that anybody like Randy Weingarten or anybody else would want any student, let alone a vulnerable black student, to be trapped in that environment.
You're a very compassionate person, and of course I knew that before I read your book.
Thank you.
But there's a lot of performativity and goodness in our society today, right? Where we're not actually caring about helping in a meaningful way, right? Like perhaps in these school systems and elsewhere. Whereas what you took from this was, wow, I want to make a difference now.
I mean, I think, as someone who is on the conservative policy side of things, I think sometimes we get accused of not having compassion or empathy, that in my view, our policies are correct, but sometimes we don't talk about them in a compassionate way to help people see that you can be the agent of your own uplift, as opposed to just saying, like, condemning people. And the worldview, in terms of the conservative worldview, is the most empowering for the individual, because it allows you to just flourish as an individual. But the thing is, there is a need for a safety net, but how do we balance that need for people who are disabled, who are mentally ill, and who cannot work? Like, there are segments of the population who have those traits, and we we should provide for them. And I think as conservatives, we don't talk about that enough. But the thing is, like, when you're talking about, for example, racial issues or poverty issues, like, the actual conservatives who donate the most to charity, give, for churches involved with food banks, it's actually conservatives who give the most, but we don't speak in a compassionate way. There's a really good book that I recommend called from Tim Keller, the late pastor Tim Keller. It's called Prodigal God, and it's the story of the prodigal son in the Bible. And he calls out the older brother in that story because, for those who aren't familiar, the prodigal son is a story about a younger brother who takes half his inheritance, says peace out, and he goes and he lives a drunken, just frivolous lifestyle, wastes all the inheritance he gets from his family, which is half of his father's estate, and gets a job feeding pigs. And he wakes up one day and realizes, you know what, even a servant is treated better than I am in this pigsty. I'm going to go back to my dad's house and be a servant for my dad. And instead, the father runs out to meet him and says, you were lost and you're found. And what does the big brother do, the one who stayed? He's angry because he doesn't want the father to throw a celebration for the younger brother coming back. Well, the older brother is the church, and the older brother, I think, in some cases, is the conservative, where it's not about excusing the sin or saying that this behavior is acceptable, but also having compassion and welcoming the prodigals back. I think that's something I've seen over and over in my life that we should be doing better as conservatives.
I picked a few quotes from your book, and I'm going to read one right next. I think it's a perfect time for that. You say, the truth is, any politician or party or policy process is a false idol. False idols are, like politics, can never fulfill the human pull in our soul towards the divine. Politics is a shoddy substitute, just like abusive man-made religion is a shoddy substitute for divine relationship. And, I've come to believe that one of the biggest, costs of the Enlightenment, with all its kind of amazing benefits, has been this kind of severing or of the awareness of the relationship, but the human relationship with the divine. Like, it became almost like the correct view, the way you were supposed to view the world, in this weird mechanistic way where God is no longer part of it, whereas traditionally it would be the sort of foundational relationship that you were acutely aware of at all times, right? And this actually comes through. This is just one quote, but this idea comes through in so many places in Voter Prophecy.
Yeah, it's so interesting because I think my book is a very typical story in that way, that it is the arc of what's happening to our country here now currently, but also more broadly, like you said, to the Enlightenment, that if you look at the long slog of human history where it's poverty, and then they call it the hockey stick of growth, the hockey stick of economic flourishing, economic lifespan being expanded, scientific discovery, that all these amazing discoveries that came because of the Enlightenment. But what ended up happening is that we put human intellect in the place of God. And so even though we are materially better off, and even though we have economic wealth, and we have health, and we have freedoms and flourishing at an individual level, really not seen compared to our ancestors, it's come at a price, and that price is the humility and the recognition of the giver of our gifts. And so what we've done is we've substituted worship for the giver of our gifts with worship of the gifts. And any society that is ordered in this way is disordered. I talk in the book about divine order, and divine order is to put God first, then people, and then things. And when I was agnostic and angry at God, or just didn't believe God existed, or was uncertain about God, that's what agnostic, I call it, a shoulder shrugger, I don't know. When I was in this place of disbelief of God, in God, or a loving God, I was living life in a disordered way, and that was the life. My order was, people. I wanted to take care of people and honor people, things, and then I was ambivalent to God. And I think in many respects that's how kind of your average spiritual but not religious person lives in some respects. They may or may not believe in God, or maybe they just think, if I'm just a good person, then that's enough. as opposed to really taking a step back and thinking about, where do I come from? What's my purpose? And I think as a society, we've lost that. And that's part of why we're seeing skyrocketing suicide, why we see skyrocketing depression. Just looking at the statistics now, Gen Z women, their suicide rate is almost double Gen X women when they were the same age now. So it's very troubling. And the highest suicide rate in 2022, which is the highest, most current we have, is the highest since the Great Depression, since 1941, coming out of the Great Depression. So something's happening to America's mental health, and that's part of why I wrote the book, is that I've had so many struggles with not only my own mental health, but people in my family, and I've seen what's worked for me, and that is returning to this understanding of God as a source of healing. And it's not certainly just me. There's so much science behind faith and belief in God and religious community, scientifically proven to heal our minds.
So we're going to take a quick break right now, and we'll be
back by the Chinese Communist Party. But no matter what, we believe that you deserve the truth, and so we'll continue to bring the truth to life. Head on over to getepic.com and try honest journalism that is based in truth and tradition. We'd love to have you on board.
as like a big threat to America right now is Christian nationalism. How do you react to that?
I think anybody who puts government as your God, whether it's a Christian or a Muslim or a Jew or Hindu or anything, if you put government as your God, then you are a fill-in-the-blank nationalist, whatever identity you put. To me, in the nefarious attribution of this phrase, Christian nationalism, to me is just simply the worship of government by someone who happens to be a Christian. And so I would disavow that. I would disagree with someone who worships government, but I would do that with an atheist as well. If an atheist is worshiping government, I disavow that too. Anybody worshiping God or government instead of God, I disavow that. I think it's wrong. Again, that's a disordered life.
I agree.
I think, though, there is a profound lack of understanding, though, about what Christians actually believed. An example was this Politico reporter who just seemed so shocked that Christians believed that the rights of people flowed from God and not from a central bureaucracy. And the fact that this was just nefarious to this Politico reporter. The only silver lining about that is that she was routinely and profoundly corrected by Christians who said, yes, us, it's we the people. So if you're worshiping government, you're actually worshiping the people, which is a very dangerous place to be. We should not be worshiping that. We should be worshiping God. But how do we make sure that we're not imposing our will in place of God? I think there are lots of controls that we can and should put in place to make sure that doesn't happen.
It's supposed to be we the people, but I guess certainly a number of people on this show and elsewhere that kind of revealed to me that it's kind of been shifting from that for a while.
Yeah, it has, and unfortunately, it's become we, this small coterie of bureaucrats who know better than we the people, and want to impose this worldview on everybody else, as opposed to having it really be something, a well-educated, civic, participating populace that's coming, that is able to voice their opinions freely, according with the First Amendment. So I think that the idea of we the people, I think it is under attack. I think also when I hear the phrase democracy dies in darkness, which is the current Washington Post motto. And look, I've written a couple of freelance pieces for the Washington Post. I have some friends who work there. I'm not anti-Washington Post. I do think that this mentality among kind of the establishment elite about this idea of democracy is in some ways really just being willfully blind to almost half the country and their worldview in terms of understanding the root of the word democracy is demos, and demos means people. And if you are completely detached from the worldview, whether it's their faith or their values, and you have no understanding or respect for that, then you are actually a threat to democracy, because you are actually not understanding demos. You're not understanding the people. You don't have a fundamental respect for we the people.
There's two different ways of viewing the world that I think about when you describe this, very broadly speaking, right? One, these would be the extremes, right? One is where, people should have the right to think and believe what they want, right? And the other one is that someone who's somehow enlightened and should have the right to make sure that others believe or think something particular, which is the correct view.
Ultimately, I think we should be centering our society on truth. But unfortunately, in our postmodern society, we have untethered ourselves from the idea that truth exists. And so if truth doesn't exist as an objective outside phenomenon, then who becomes the arbiter of truth? Well, whoever gets the most power or whoever gets the most credentialing. And so I think the danger of that, again, is to worship the created instead of the creator. Creator is the source of truth. The arrogance of imposing as a human your interpretation of truth versus the truth, and of course that's where always the dispute is what is truth. But I think the overall idea of coercion versus persuasion is ultimately going to be the biggest question of our time, because we were founded as one nation under God, not one nation under a small elite cabal of people who have convinced themselves they embody truth or that they know my truth, and my truth is to be imposed on other people. I think also the kind of the broader question of our country in terms of, for me, I see my life in the book. I rejected a lot of the Judeo-Christian underpinnings for a long time because I had been abused in the name of God. And I lived in this place of darkness and anger and antipathy, even though I called myself a secular conservative. So it was almost like an oxymoron. I respected religion in the sense of that I could see that it could be some glue, but I didn't actually believe that there was an objective truth necessarily.
And if I can jump in, what really strikes me here is that there were these underpinnings, but there was also this coercion that you didn't even fully realize was coercion because it was routine. It was just how you lived, and it took you a lot to just kind of figure this all out, right? And this again speaks to your compassionate nature to be able to look at it through a somewhat benevolent lens afterwards.
Yeah, and I think the Bible says where the Spirit of the Lord is, there's freedom. And this is also the tension, though, because the Bible also says, do not abuse your freedom to make bad choices. And so that's the paradox of America, is that we are born and designed to be free. But unfortunately, because we are flawed and our human nature is to depravity, if we allow the freedom to basically run amok and just have our most base impulses govern our society, then our society will collapse. And I think that's kind of what's happening. Irving Kristol, who was kind of one of the godfathers of the conservative movement, he had a book. It was really a collection of essays, but the title, I think, was a very telling title, which is, he called it 2 Cheers for Capitalism. And he said, I withhold that third cheer because at the end of the day, like, a free market is basically just a very well-oiled machine for maximizing production and productivity and giving goods at a low cost. Well, that third cheer is really the ethics and the morals and the programming of that machine. And there's been no successful long-term society that has not programmed and elevated that capitalistic machine in a long-term way that's sustainable. And quite often it will actually elevate destructive, corrosive things, whether it's bad food that's bad for yourself. We're having this terrible obesity crisis. I mean, the fact that so many young men are not eligible for the military because they're obese, that's a huge red flag. Or elevating, technology in the way it's so addictive, but it's through the capitalistic machine. So we as a society, we have to reprogram that machine, I believe, in a way that we are controlling it instead of allowing it to control us by elevating and perpetuating this like pop sugar, pop culture that rots your brain, content that's not. I mean, you don't see it with the CCP, but the CCP controls the content on TikTok. You can bet they do. But that's the paradox of living in a free society, that it's more of the cultural controls that are put in place through the traditions of faith and family that are of a free, private nature that create pro-social controls on capitalism, as opposed to the CCP, which is imposing a government mandate. And so America is an experiment in this freedom of private control over the culture, as opposed to the CCP, which is government control.
Well, Carrie Sheffield, it's such a pleasure to have had you on.
Thank you, Jan.
Thank you all for joining Carrie Sheffield and me on this episode of American Thought Leaders. I'm your host, Jan Jekielek.